About 4,000 years ago, the Jews first emerged in Israel, and they were called the Israelites. Numerically, they were and are a very small nation. But the leaders of those Israelites, Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, amongst others, have achieved a universal influence over all of us. And one of Israel's sons, Jesus Christ, has extended the Jewish light to be used or misused into every shadow. The Jews in Israel were subject to massive attacks from Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and finally Rome. The Jews fought to stay in the land of Israel, but their efforts were finally overwhelmed by the destruction of their temple in Jerusalem by Rome. And here at this stronghold of Masada, from that time, the Jews were forced to wander the earth, keenly loyal to the host nations wherever they were, but never forgetting their spiritual center, Jerusalem. The Jews also read in their Bible, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning." The Bible was called by many Jews our portable homeland. David Ben Gurion was born at Plonsk in Poland. His name then was David Green. Later, here in this promised land of Israel, he changed it to Ben Gurion, naming himself after a Jewish leader who had fought against the Roman army of occupation in Israel 1,900 years earlier. Why would David Green, together with millions of other Jews, wish to leave their adopted homes around the world? Well, loyalty to Russia, Poland, Germany, France, Italy, England, etc. was not always enough. Human societies ever have an inclination to reject a people who are different. And what was different about the Jews was, ironically, their faith, contained in the pages of their Bible, known to us Christians as the Old Testament. And that holy book informed all Jews that they must strive to be a light unto the nations of the world. Quickly, the world penalized the Jews for this difference, built ghettos to isolate them, and the bestial pogroms blossomed. Ben Gurion has said, "My grandfather began teaching me Hebrew. Listening to grandfather telling stories of Jewish history, I clearly recall thinking to myself, Plonsk isn't my real home." By the age of 19 years, David was in Warsaw, helping to organize a Jewish workers' movement called Workers of Zion. It was doubly dangerous, being both Jewish and socialist, and all within the Russian Tsar's orbit. And twice he was arrested. David's good father, Avigdor Green, secured his release from prison. Avigdor was proud but uneasy. He said, "You'll end up on the barricades." Well, that proved to be true. But they weren't to be the barricades of Warsaw. And by this time, the Jewish visionary Theodor Herzl had spoken. The aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine. Without a Jewish homeland, there is no hope of destroying Jewish bondage. Young David Green packed his bags, said goodbye, and proceeded to retrace the path his forefathers and mothers had traveled some 1,900 years before back to Israel. He traveled fourth class on a Russian freighter, sleeping on the deck. David landed here at this port of Jaffa in the year 1906. At that time, there were about 50,000 Jews living in Palestine, many of them remnants of Middle East antiquity, and the rest relative new arrivals such as David. The land, the promised land of Israel, was at that time a desolate backwater of the degenerate Turkish Empire. Already David carried in himself two obsessions which never ever left him. First, that the Jews could only repossess their ancient homeland by working on it. And second, they must reject the language of the ghettos in Europe and speak colloquially the language of their Bible, Hebrew, which at that time was only used by Jewish scholars. David joined the Palestinian branch of the Workers of Zion, and he stood up and said, "We Jews must never deviate from our pioneering mission to create a Hebrew-speaking working class." Then David decided to visit the Jewish settlements northeastward up in Galilee. But that was not an easy journey. First, he would have to cross a 20-mile area of near desert where roaming Arabs were watching to rob and perhaps kill any traveler. Then through the Sumerian hills, down to the vicinity of the Sea of Galilee, where another Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, had spoken most of his message to humankind. David reached this Jewish outpost of Segera unscathed. He described his work here thus: "We would work on land which the Jews had bought. We would make it ready for planting so that it could be settled rapidly by permanent settlers following on behind us. Then we would move off to work a new tract. I felt that I was a partner in the act of creation." But then David observed the first stirrings of an awful impending conflict. The Arabs around the Jewish settlements belonged to the Zubach tribe, and they were no more than brigands. Therefore, the Jews were employing local Circassians to protect their farms from Arab raids. David challenged the Jewish farmers. Don't you understand that it is degrading to employ others to protect you? We must protect ourselves from Arab robbers. But we are a peaceful people. We Jews don't know how to use guns. Then you must learn. And I will see that you get the guns. This was the very beginning of the Jewish self-defense movement, which in due course was to become the renowned Haganah Army, which in its turn was to become the Israeli army. David was now 21 years old, but his hair was already streaked with white. Then David received an urgent message from Jerusalem. Would he help edit a monthly journal to be printed in the Hebrew language? He stated, I am torn between the wish to remain a laborer and the wish to use whatever talent I have to advance the Jewish people. The journal was called Unity, and it was while working for it that he changed his name to Ben Gurion. David Ben Gurion was ever peering into the future. He stated, after several months in Jerusalem, it became clear to me that in order to get anywhere with the Turkish authorities, I needed to know the Turkish language and Turkish law. My idea was to go to Turkey and, having achieved those two objectives, to stand for the Turkish parliament. I thought that I would then be able to assist a Jewish freedom movement. And then everything, everywhere, turned to chaos. It was August 1914, and Turkey was moving towards a military alliance with Germany. The First World War was in the air. Ben Gurion returned here to Jerusalem to find most Jewish hard work in ruins. There was starvation, and the Turks were giving the Jews a very bad time. David was arrested and placed in this old city jail. He was taken before a notorious Turk named Hassan Bey. When did you join the Zionists? I was a Zionist in Russia. Who were the leaders of this movement in Jerusalem? Me? You are just a lot of dogs. First you come here from Russia without permission, then you set up your own organizations. Sir, I am not a dog. Take him back to jail. However, David was relatively lucky. He was simply expelled to Egypt, where the British arrested him. It was now clear that the only reasonable patch left for a Zionist was the United States of America. He managed to reach Ellis Island during the summer of 1915. A new star had arisen in the Jewish world, Chaim Weizmann, major scientist and wise Zionist. Powerful world leaders listened to him more than to any other Jew. Chaim Weizmann left Switzerland in 1904 and, arriving in Britain, stated, "My Zionist views have led me to look upon England as the one country likely to show a genuine sympathy for our Jewish movement. I have a profound admiration for England. Ben Gurion was astonished at this assessment of the British. But suddenly, in the year 1917, the British government, through its Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, issued a grand imperial commitment. The British government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. That British document is known as the Balfour Declaration. Ben Gurion began to urge Jews here in this city of New York to join the British Army and fight. Then he himself hurried to Canada, where he anxiously volunteered. Soon he was a hard-working corporal in the British Royal Fusiliers. But before leaving New York, he married a good Jewish girl, a Miss Paula Munweis. With the coming of peace, Ben Gurion thundered his activities for the Jewish people in Palestine. But everywhere there were towering obstacles. Ben Gurion formed a new political party, which he called Unity of Labor. But Jews are too individualistic to unite easily. And the British government, who are now governing Palestine, were too busy assessing Britain's imperial interests in the Middle East to even look at the Balfour Declaration. And most sinister of all, a very cool political operator was decidedly to the fore amongst the Palestinian Arabs, a certain Haj Amin el-Husseini, later to achieve worldwide fame as the Mufti of Jerusalem. Haj Amin, the Mufti, observed that the victorious allies, Britain and France, were beginning to carve up the Middle East to their own strategic and commercial advantages. Oil was already in the air, and the Mufti wanted the Palestinian slice of that Middle Eastern cake. He watched and waited from his holy Muslim territory here in the old city of Jerusalem, silently daring the British to carry out their promise given to the Jews in the Balfour Declaration. The British did nothing. Gradually, the Mufti stirred up his Arab followers with increasingly outrageous propaganda, culminating in a story that the Jews were planning to overwhelm this Muslim Mosque of Omar and there rebuild their ancient Jewish temple. The story was cold and calculating. The Palestinian Arabs believed this fanatic. The tension became lethal. The British did nothing. And then the Mufti's Arabs attacked on August the 23rd, 1929. They went for the ancient Jewish Orthodox community in Jerusalem, where the people had lived peaceably for centuries. 140 Jews were battered to death before the British moved. The pogrom, for that is what it was repeated at the towns of Haifa, Hebron, and Safed. Ben Gurion said, "We must find a way to the heart of the Arab people. I feel diminished by the death of anyone, Jew or Arab. But now, at painful last, Ben Gurion was forced to doubt his highest hopes for Jewish-Arab peace." And then, out of the darkness, came total, overwhelming moral disaster. Adolf Hitler gained authority in Germany, and the Nazis began to organize the genocide of all Jewish people. And immediately, Ben Gurion was made chairman of this Jewish agency, the international organization working for the prayed-for promised land of Israel, now a terrible, urgent necessity. Ben Gurion nursed the fantasy that all of suffering Jewry in Europe could find refuge in Palestine. Yes, the millions. He said, "We Jews watch in agony, our brothers and sisters lined up in terror. So long as Israel lives, it must provide refuge from such atrocity." The Mufti of Jerusalem decided that this was the time to make an all-out assault on the Jews of Palestine. Quietly, he had been receiving military equipment from Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. His Arab people began to kill Jews during April 1936, and the Jewish army Haganah began to prepare a defense. Britain sent for military reinforcements, and martial law was proclaimed. And then both Mussolini and Hitler began to contribute money to the Mufti and his Arabs. The situation was beginning to become internationally lethal. Ben Gurion observed, "Even if Britain makes trouble for us in Palestine, it is inconceivable that we Jews will be on Hitler's side." Sadly, not so the Arabs. Well, the British were well aware of these naked realities, but with Middle Eastern military strategic issues heavily in the air, the British wanted to appease the Arab world. After all, how many countries did the Jews own? They hadn't even got Israel yet. So, the British called a conference at this St. James's Palace here in London, where they would adjudicate between Arab and Jew. The Jews, not being fools, approached the meeting with grim forebodings. Ben Gurion looked at the British rulers of Palestine and remarked, "You have to learn manners and etiquette from these English dignitaries. Even when they lead you up to be hanged, they maintain their courtesy and their smiles." In this palace, Britain decided, through its colonial secretary, whose name I prefer not to mention, well, it was Malcolm MacDonald, that immigration of Jews into Palestine must be formidably restricted. And remember, the year was 1939, and that no more land must be sold to Jews over large parts of Palestine, and that the British Colonial Secretary and Company rejected, of all things, the moral validity of the Balfour Declaration, the solemn promise given by Britain to the Jews long before in 1917. Chamberlain's betrayal of the Czechoslovakian people at Munich was not unique. Ben Gurion replied to the British, "The Jewish people have no army, navy, or air force. But if you try and force minority status on us in our own national home, you will have to keep a much larger army in Palestine than you have now. And even then, you won't succeed." But it was now a nightmarish situation for the Jews in Palestine. Many thousands of them were volunteering to fight by the side of the British, whose government was prohibiting their very relatives who managed to escape from the Nazis from entering into their promised land. Meanwhile, a final cruel irony was being enacted. The Mufti of Jerusalem had fled from Palestine and had thrown his person into Hitler's orbit. Deprived of an active leader, the Mufti's Arabs simply watched from the sidelines, but admiring Adolf Hitler, whom they called Abu Ali. It was enough comfort for the hard-pressed British that the Arabs were generally militarily passive, though helping the Nazis a little wherever they could. Then Ben Gurion put his whole weight into trying to persuade the British to allow the formation of an all-Jewish army with the Star of David on their military shoulders. Unfortunately, the new British Colonial Office official was Lord Lloyd, who, how shall I put it? Well, he was not passionately fond of Jews, but at least Lord Lloyd was straightforward in his prejudice. I ought to tell you that while you consider me an enemy, you have even bigger enemies at the British War Office. Why is it that there are so many people against you? Apparently, it must be our fault, because it has already been going on for 2,000 years. The trouble is, you are such bad mixers. If you really want victory, why can't you just enlist in the British Army? Why would you need a Jewish brigade? Why don't you ask these things of the French, the Czechs, or the Poles, who all have their own units and their own countries? And then, at that explosive moment, the British High Commissioner in Palestine added his anti-Semitic insult. He broadcast words of encouragement to the Arabs, and at the same time blasted Jewish hopes for the future. Ben Gurion did not dally in his reply. Palestine is being transformed by the British into an Anglo-Arab state with a Jewish ghetto, while we Jews are playing our part, no less than Britain or Russia, in this holy war to defeat the Nazis. The British High Commissioner says there are countries in Europe which have suffered infinitely more than Palestine. True. But what about the Jewish people who are suffering infinitely more than any other people? You get the impression that the British rulers of Palestine have never opened their Bible, never heard anything of the Balfour Declaration, nor visited any Jewish settlements. And then, at long last, out of the blue, Winston Churchill intervened with humanity and statesmanship. It was mid-1944. It seems to me indeed appropriate that a special Jewish military brigade of that race which has suffered indescribable torments from the Nazis should be represented as a distinct military formation among the forces gathered for Hitler's final overthrow. This speech was a godsend to most Jews, and the Jewish brigade was formed and went into action on the continent of Europe. But Churchill's speech had said nothing about allowing the desperate Jewish refugees from Hitler's obscenity into Palestine. And so, an extreme right-wing Jewish organization with its own private army called Irgun Zvai Leumi, and which was soon to be led by young Menachem Begin, began preparing lethal action against anti-Jewish elements in the British Middle Eastern administration. And one of Irgun's extremists, Avraham Stern, felt even stronger about British prejudice against the Jews. And he broke away from Irgun with what became known as the Stern Gang. And two of Stern's angry patriots traveled to Cairo and shot dead there the British Minister for the Middle East, Lord Moyne. Well, Ben Gurion didn't agree with such methods. He stated, there are two choices facing us Jews: terrorism or a Zionist political struggle. On May the 8th, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered and the war in Europe was finished. It has been calculated that the Nazis had murdered 6 million Jews. That is over 1/3 of every Jew in the world. Ben Gurion hastened to the indescribable camps and gave what comfort he could to the remnant of survivors. During these 6 years of war, we never forgot you for a single day. We have been working to build up our land in Palestine so that you may go there to live as decent human beings again amongst your own people, and where you will not fear again. And then, at the general election here in Britain, the Labour Party won, the equivalent of Ben Gurion's party over in Palestine. Ben Gurion said, "The British worker will understand our Zionist aims." Ha! The British Labour government appointed Ernest Bevin, the trade unionist leader, as Foreign Secretary. And unfortunately, he often personified the old trade union joke of an obstinate, prejudiced cart horse. But on the subject of Jews, Bevin, with an I, was not funny. One of his first public utterances on the subject was,
"I am very anxious that Jews left in Europe shall not overemphasize their racial status. If the Jews try to push to the head of the queue, there is danger of a renewed anti-Semitic reaction throughout Europe."
And then the awful man, turning on Ben Gurion and company, growled,
"If it's war you want, we'll meet head on."
Ben Gurion replied, "We, the Jews of the land of Israel, do not want to be killed. But we too, like you British, have something that is more precious than life. And I want to tell Bevin that we are prepared to be killed, but not to concede 3 things. Freedom of Jewish immigration into Palestine, our right to rebuild the wilderness of our ancient homeland, and the political independence of our people in that homeland." Bevin immediately gave orders for more British soldiers to enter Palestine. Soon there would be 100,000 of them. Ben Gurion stated, "Soon Palestine will become a national home for the British Army." And then he demanded of Bevin that 100,000 suffering Jews should immediately be moved from the European camps into Palestine, to which request Bevin unbelievably rejoined,
"The immigration of 100,000 Jews will step up anti-Semitic feelings in the British Army."
Well, that did it. Ben Gurion's Haganah army immediately joined forces with Menachem Begin's Irgun's vile Lumi, and with the Stern Gang, and with any other Jew who was prepared to make war on Bevin's appalling crudity. And the sparks flew. The combined Jewish patriots tore up the British military railroads and blew up the British Coast Guard boats that were primarily engaged in driving Jewish refugees from the coast of Palestine back to sea. Then a warning came to the British from Menachem Begin's Irgun that in half an hour's time, this southern wing of the King David Hotel here in Jerusalem, which housed British military intelligence, would be blown up. The British failed to react, and up it went. 90 people died. When the British hanged members of Irgun here in this awful place, Irgun promptly hanged British sergeants in return. Ben Gurion reiterated his antipathy for all forms of terrorism, but he also said, this Jewish resistance movement is a new event in the chronicles of Israel. But there are Jews in the European camps at this moment for whom immigration to Palestine is a matter of life and death. For them, the land of Israel is not Zionism. It is not ideology, but it is a condition for survival. The fate of those Jews is in this land of Israel, or it is in death. And that too, Bevin, is power. Ernest Bevin and the British Labour government which he represented became deeply loathed by caring Jews far and wide. But America was now in the ascendancy, and fortunately their President Truman began to intervene positively by stating that the Jews must be allowed into Palestine. Bevin, in his blundering crudity, simply said,
the Americans are trying to help the Jews emigrate to Palestine because they do not want them in New York.
Americans, and not necessarily Jews, rioted against Bevin and accurately pointed out that this was the language of Adolf Hitler. But Britain had not quite finished with Jewish hopes for Palestine, however. An ex-Mississippi riverboat, renamed the Exodus, and crammed with 4,500 Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, sailed openly towards the Palestinian coast. The Exodus flew the blue and white flag at her masthead. What would Bevin's British Armed Forces dare to do? Well, they dared all right. Royal Air Force planes bore down on the Exodus, and Royal Naval destroyers closed in. There was gunfire, and the Exodus was escorted into Haifa harbor. There, the Jews were removed from the Exodus, put aboard 3 British prison ships, and carted back to the camps in Germany. On November the 29th, 1947, the United Nations voted by 33 votes to 13 for Britain to leave Palestine by May the 14th, 1948, and for the formation of a Jewish independent state and an Arab independent state, with Jerusalem to become an international zone. It is one of the rare occasions when the United States of America and Russia have joined hands. Britain, I regret to report, abstained. Well, Israel was virtually in existence. The proposed Jewish state was bits and pieces on the west side of the River Jordan. As far as I know, no national territory has ever been so vulnerably shaped as this homeland given to the Jews by the United Nations. Fine if you can totally trust your neighbors. Ben Gurion was by the Dead Sea when he heard the pronouncement from the United Nations. He said, that night, crowds danced. I could not dance. I knew that we faced war, and that in it, we would lose the best of our youth. Immediately, Arabs and some British volunteers began to infiltrate Jewish settlements. These people cut the free road between Tel Aviv and free Jerusalem and closed in on that city, killing Jews wherever they could. The official British military tended to keep out of the way when these murderous episodes erupted. Winston Churchill described this period as Ernest Bevin's dirty war against the Jews of Palestine. Ben Gurion, who was already known as the Old Man, then delved into a monumental crash course on the art of war. He studied military classics and questioned closely his young Haganah commanders. What military equipment do you think we need? Sten guns. And what about cannon and airplanes? There's going to be a war. The Arab countries will unite and there will be battlefronts. It is essential that we set up a modern army. Ben Gurion sent Mrs. Golda Meir to the United States of America to ask the Jews there for help. When she arrived, she had $10 in her purse. When she returned, 2 months later, she had $50 million. But For the time being, the Israelis were very poorly off indeed, and they were suffering casualties all over their small territory. Jerusalem was in imminent peril. Ben Gurion ordered a meeting of his Haganah commanders. There is one burning question, and that is the battle for the road to Jerusalem. The fall of Jewish Jerusalem would be a death blow to the Jewish community there. For the first time, I am issuing a military order. In 2 days' time, at dawn, you must concentrate 2,000 men and 2,000 rifles. Young Jews left their defensive positions around the scattered kibbutzim, and the battle for the road to Jerusalem began. On April the 5th, 1948, that city was relieved and fed. It was a deeply significant turning point between Arabs and Jews. Until that time, Arabs had called Jews the children of death, because the Jews apparently preferred to die passively rather than to fight back. Well, that Jewish attitude was now finished with a vengeance, and the Arabs were beginning to realize it. But heavy, violent mortality continued amongst a Jewish population which at that time was considerably less than the population of my minute country, Wales. And amongst the Jews of Palestine, they were all family. Outraged and darkly independent, Menachem Begin's Irgun Zvi Leumi decided to capture an Arab stronghold named Deir Yassin, just outside of Jerusalem. And when Irgun had completed this operation, not only were the Arab fighters dead, but so were women and children. This is Deir Yassin. It is Israel's one positive atrocity. The Deir Yassin massacre lowers over Israel to this day, and most Jews still beat their breasts in bitter regret. Ben Gurion sent a message to King Abdullah of Jordan, expressing his profound shock. And the Jews held Jerusalem. The Arab assault on the Jews began to disintegrate. Haganah, under Ben Gurion's direction, began to clear the armed Arabs out of all Jewish territory. And as they did so, a strange phenomenon took place. Many thousands of civilian Arabs fled out of Palestine. An impending united Arab army command had ordered the civilian Arabs to leave for the Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. The high command order was, get out of the Jewish territories. Then our Arab armies will remove all of the Jews, and then you may come back. And with that order, the United Arab Command pointed at Deir Yassin to warn hesitant Arabs what fate they might expect from the Jews if they remained. Of course, this was an untruth. Ben Gurion and his Haganah army were incapable of such an act, but the Arabs fled in massive numbers. The Jews urged them on the radio, etc., not to be frightened and to stay. But the Arabs went. These Arabs are the self-same Palestine refugees of today. In general, Jews did not drive them out, but other Arabs certainly did. Mystified, Ben Gurion hastened to see what was happening. He stated, "Haifa is a horrifying and fantastic sight. A dead city. How could tens of thousands of people leave their homes in such panic with no adequate reason? What brought about their flight? Was it only an Arab order from above, or was it fear?" The Americans lost their nerve. They knew that the big Arab states were planning to attack minute Israel once again, and they didn't want aggravation in the Middle East. Oil, amongst other things. The American Secretary of State, George Marshall, warned Israel, "Don't rely on your military advisors. They are intoxicated with success after their victories. But what happens if there is a protracted or massive Arab invasion? If you proclaim your Jewish state, I shall be happy. But yours is a very grave responsibility." On May the 12th, 1948, the British-led Arab Legion from Transjordan attacked Jewish settlements in Palestine. At a place called Kfar Etzion, the Jews were forced to raise the white flag of surrender, and then the Arabs murdered almost all of them. It was truly a time for the momentous decision. 2,000 years is a long time, but now or never. It was May the 14th, and the British Army was leaving Jewish Palestine. Ben Gurion's mind was clearly made up. At 4 p.m., he was driven to this Tel Aviv museum, and as he and Paula, his wife, got out of their car, a Jewish policeman saluted him. Ben Gurion was prepared for everything except that. Momentarily he paused, then he straightened his shoulders and gave a very positive salute in return. Inside the building, Ben Gurion banged the table with a gavel. The people present, with no previous instructions, got onto their feet and began to sing the Zionist anthem, which is called Hatikvah. It was not a long ceremony. Ben Gurion ended his Declaration of Independence in very direct style. Accordingly, we representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Israel and of the Zionist movement are here present on the day of the termination of the British mandate. And by virtue of our historic right and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations, we declare the establishment of a Jewish state to be known as the State of Israel. Ben Gurion then banged the table a second time. He simply said, "The State of Israel has arisen. This meeting is now closed." On that very day, the armies of Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Transjordan invaded the small, irregular patch of land now known as the State of Israel. All that Ben Gurion commanded to fight back with was virtually a guerrilla army of amateur soldiers with small arms. The very first kibbutz ever to be built, Degania, was about to be overrun by Syrian tank columns. A deputation from that place hurried to Ben Gurion, who sent for General Yigael Yadin, who said, "There is no solution other than to let the Arabs approach to within 20 yards of the gateway and then to throw Molotov cocktails at the Syrian tanks." It is impossible to comprehend how, but the Syrian Arabs were thrown back from the gate of Degania. An Israeli staff officer looked at the impossible odds and said, "In another 72 hours, we'll be defeated." And at that juncture, a miracle occurred which was fit for the prophets of the Bible. The first of the old military aircraft which Ben Gurion had ordered arrived for the Israelis. Ironically, they were Second World War German Messerschmitts. And then came a ship with 5,000 old rifles and 45 pieces of obsolete artillery. And Ben Gurion was never less than positive. This is the turning point of the war. We must go over to the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Transjordan, and Syria. The plan for this week: the liberation of Jerusalem. And if Egypt dares to fight back, we shall bomb Port Said, Alexandria, and Cairo. Well, that can only be described as optimism. Jerusalem was always Ben Gurion's priority. It was part mystical. And there at Jerusalem, Transjordan's Arab Legion was pressing the Jewish quarter very hard. Ben Gurion said, "I demand that a military column be sent to Jerusalem." General Yadin remonstrated. The road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is overlooked by the Latrun Heights, which is strongly held by the Arab Legion, with tanks and artillery. All we have free is One inexperienced brigade. I'll reinforce this brigade with our Jewish immigrants that are now coming off ships. They have never held a rifle in their lives. They can't even understand Hebrew. I'm prepared to take responsibility for the risk. You are asking for the impossible. Attack! Whatever the cost. The attack began on May the 25th, 1948. And the cost to the Israelis was very high. The shocked Jewish recruits fell back in disorder as the Transjordan army appeared at this Fort Latrun and all around blasted them. But Ben Gurion was once again totally obsessed with relieving the Jews of Jerusalem. On May the 30th, the Israeli brigade tried a second time, and on June the 9th, death and failure. But then an alternative was thought of. A track was constructed through the hills beyond and out of range of these Arab Legion emplacements. Jewish civilians from Tel Aviv helped the Israeli soldiers build the pathway and carry supplies to Jerusalem. On June the 11th, a truce was agreed to between the Israelis and the Arab armies, organized by the United Nations. And as welcome as this was to both sides, it created for Ben Gurion a new and traumatic emergency. 11 days earlier, on June the 1st, Menachem Begin had signed an agreement with Ben Gurion's provisional government, promising that Mr. Begin's private army, Irgun Zvi Leumi, would unite with the official Israeli army, Haganah. On June the 20th, a ship reached the Israeli coast packed with weapons which had been paid for by supporters of Begin in America. And it quickly emerged that in spite of Mr. Begin's agreement with Ben Gurion to unite their forces, he now planned to give a substantial proportion of these weapons to his own Irgun men. Ben Gurion firmly opposed Menachem Begin's plans. He stated, "There are not going to be two armies. We must decide whether to hand over power to Begin or tell him to cease his separatist activities. If Begin does not give in, we shall open fire." Suddenly, the threat of an Israeli civil war was in the air again, while a critical truce with the Arab nations was quivering all around. Menachem Begin was already aboard his gun-running ship, which was called the Altalina, and he was in no way cowed. "If Ben Gurion wants to meet me, let him come here. I'm prepared to meet him there on the land. Either Begin's Irgun accepts orders from us, or we shoot." Hundreds of supporters of Begin and his Irgun army poured out of Tel Aviv to help unload the Altalina. It has been said that Ben Gurion was like a lion in a cage, striding up and down, talking to himself. Suddenly he said, "Concentrate firepower to bring about unconditional surrender." And finally, he was heard to say, "Catch Begin! Catch Begin!" The Altalina virtually exploded out of the water. Menachem Begin escaped, and that night he broadcast on Irgun's underground radio. Ben Gurion is a fool. A wave of my finger will eliminate Ben Gurion. But we of Irgun will not open fire on Ben Gurion's army. There will be no fraternal strife while the Arab foe is at the gateway. Having frustrated Begin's right-wing challenge, Ben Gurion continued to rise above political interests. He looked critically at the structure of the Israeli army itself. He noted that its leadership was dominated by left-wingers from his old socialist days, and that, he decided, was not good enough. The Israeli army must be led by young, non-political, professional soldiers. And even during that dangerous truce, he pushed these ideas forward. There was a revolt of his generals, and Ben Gurion simply tendered his resignation, and the revolt ended. By the time the Arab-Israeli truce had ceased, Ben Gurion had reorganized the army, and indeed Israel was better prepared. The Egyptian army didn't wait for the United Nations truce to end. On July the 8th, they delivered an all-out attack in the south. But now, the Israelis seemed invincible. All of the Arab armies were beaten back beyond the borders of their own countries, and the emerging Israeli Air Force bombed Cairo and Damascus to make the point clear. As the Egyptian army retreated pell-mell into the Sinai Desert, Israelis pursued them. And at that event, British Royal Air Force Spitfire aircraft bearing British markings attacked the Israelis. At that time, there were British military garrisons on Egyptian territory, and Ernest Bevin couldn't resist the temptation. Well, Ben Gurion didn't like it, but up went the new Israeli Air Force and shot down 5 British Spitfires. And when the armistice finally came, Israel's borders were more secure, though still in hazard. Towards the end of 1949, the United Nations reaffirmed its decision to internationalize Jerusalem. Ben Gurion was informed that only Israel would vote against the idea. He happened to be reading his Bible here in his house in Tel Aviv. He looked up and said, well, that is the only vote that counts. But he took the precaution of speedily moving the Israeli government from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem overnight and stating, look, during the course of our War of Independence, when Jerusalem was besieged by Arab armies, the Israeli government had been obliged to take up its temporary seat in Tel Aviv. But now the state of Israel has only one capital, Jerusalem, the Eternal. Ben Gurion always worked hard to bring Jews and Arabs closer together, short of putting the state of Israel in jeopardy. And he had learned to respect the Arab king, Abdallah of Transjordan, whom Ben Gurion knew had dangerous Arab problems. Nevertheless, Ben Gurion sent emissaries to the king, including his young protege, Moshe Dayan. And in due course, King Abdallah actually initialed the draft of a peace treaty with Israel. But as he did so, he looked up and said, of course, I have to receive the approval of the British representative here in Jordan. And the British, for very much their own political ambitions, made that potential peace treaty with Israel void. But the British were not the most dangerous inhibition to King Abdallah's hopes for peace with the Israelis. The Mufti of Jerusalem was still alive, and one of his followers killed the king here on the steps of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The truth is, tragically, that any Arab who extends a hand of peace to the Israelis is immediately in danger of being placed on an Arab list to be murdered. Whether in London, Bethlehem, or Cairo, it makes little difference. Well, with Israel's Jewish population now doubled, money became a desperate necessity, and Ben Gurion began to consider an explosive idea. He approached the German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, for a sum of money to be given to Israel as token reparations for material wealth that the Jews had lost under the Nazis. The figure that Ben Gurion suggested was over $1 billion. Immediately, Chancellor Adenauer agreed. But nevertheless, in Israel, the explosion occurred, and it was ignited by the Israeli communists and most dangerously by Menachem Begin of the political right wing. Begin created a national riot. He said,
"Today, Ben Gurion is about to go to Germany to receive money. He will sell the honor of the Jewish people for monetary gain. There is not one German who did not murder our parents. Every German is a Nazi. Every German is a murderer. Adenauer is a murderer."
I sympathize deeply with Mr. Begin's obsession with the Holocaust, but those words are brutally unjust. Ben Gurion said in the Israeli parliament. Over 6 million Jews were put to death by the Nazis. A crime of such enormous proportions can have no material compensation. However, even after the defeat of the Hitler regime, the German people continues to enjoy the fruits of the robbery of the Jews who were murdered. The government of Israel considers itself bound to demand of the German people restitution for this stolen Jewish property. A vote was taken in the Israeli parliament, and it was a close matter. They voted to accept the money by 61 to 50. Germany paid promptly and thereby helped Israel's financial recovery. One day during 1953, Ben Gurion traveled through the Negev desert on official business. He has described what happened. I told the driver to leave the main road for a track into the desert. I wanted to get away from my duties for a few minutes to feel the vastness of those open spaces with their message of hope, and also as a reminder of the smallness of humankind in this infinite universe. Suddenly, we saw a group of young people close to a few wooden shacks. I asked, "What are you doing out here?"
Prime Minister, we fought the Egyptian invasion in this area during the War of Independence. We're building a new kibbutz. We are calling it Stable Care.
Can you survive here in the desert?
Prime Minister, we know that a Semitic tribe lived here in settlements 2,000 years ago. If they could survive, so can we.
May I join you? May I become a member of your kibbutz at Stable Care? Leaving the desert, Ben Gurion put his government in order and checked every aspect of the defenses of Israel. And then, at the end of 1953, he handed his secretary, Yitzhak Nabon, a piece of paper. These are the measurements of my study here in Tel Aviv. Tell them to build the hut to the same dimensions. What hut? In the kibbutz of Stable Care. I am going to live in that place. Ben Gurion resigned as prime minister, and he broadcast to an astonished nation. He took his text from the book of Psalms. Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor mine eyes lofty. Neither do I exercise myself in great matters, or in things too high for me. During the first quarter of 1954, Gamal Nasser became the virtual dictator of Egypt, and his ambition was to be paramount throughout the Arab world. President Eisenhower of America was desperate to appease the Arabs, oil again and again, and he was ever poised to keep the Russians out. Eisenhower persuaded a declining Winston Churchill to remove the British civil and military organizations from the Suez Canal zone.
At Beaucaire, Ben Gurion paused in his manual work. The British, for all of their toffee-nosed arrogance, were a more stable influence on the borders of Israel than Arabs with their potential for hysteria. And wouldn't the British military installations now become Egyptian? Ben Gurion put down whatever agricultural tool he was wielding and hastened back to Jerusalem, where he anxiously accepted the job of Minister of Defense. Ben Gurion, back in this office, put politeness away. He said, "We have developed a generation of cowards. No more. This must be a fighting generation." General Moshe Dayan was very relieved to hear it. More Egyptian soldiers came into Israel at night and murdered in isolated places. From Ben Gurion to Dayan, a reprisal was ordered. 150 Israeli paratroopers raided an Egyptian army depot outside of Gaza. The Israelis killed 38 Egyptian soldiers. President Nasser was very cross. Oh, and the Israeli raid was led by a youngster named Arik Sharon. The fighting generation was back. But the same dreadful pattern continued. Egyptian raids on Israeli civilians, and then the Israelis would shoot down any Egyptian military aircraft that penetrated their airspace. Very positive action was now essential. On November the 2nd, 1955, Ben Gurion became Prime Minister once again. And then Nasser responded with the shock announcement that Egypt had achieved a massive arms deal with Russia, though they called it Czechoslovakia. Almost all of the Arab world became ecstatic. Nasser was the great hero. Now, only the destruction of Israel had to be achieved. But Nasser was not a shrinking soul. He simply nationalized the Suez Canal. Oh boy, the mighty scientific industrial European nations were to be at the behest of Gamal Nasser of Egypt? And who had inspired and designed and paid for the bloody canal anyway? Why, France and Britain. Anyway, Ben Gurion now had two potential powerful allies. However, Britain was well into its grey-spirited decline. Not a whiff of Maggie Thatcher from Land's End to John O'Groats. Yes, all three nations, Britain, France, and Israel, wanted Nasser out, and the Suez Canal made a safe, dependable area. But Britannia, particularly, wanted her role in any affair smelling of roses. What Britain and France wanted was a good pretext, an acceptable reason in the eyes of the world for attacking Egypt and taking back the Suez Canal. The idea, duly concocted,
was that Israel would perform the initial military attack against the Egyptians. And Israel had plenty of legitimate reasons for doing so. Nasser was daily telling the Arab world that he was going to obliterate Israel. Then, 36 hours after the Israeli attack had begun, British and French forces would intervene to save the Suez Canal from the ravages of war. Ben Gurion didn't like the subterfuge. His ethics were of a higher order than Eden and Company. But he stated, well, we Israelis will not have to face Nasser alone as he grows stronger and conquers all of the Arab countries. Moshe Dayan was in charge of the Israeli part of the tripartite military deal. His responsibilities were to drive the Egyptians out of the Sinai. On the 29th of October, 1956, Moshe Dayan's Israeli soldiers went into action on their own. On the 31st of October, Britain and France were due to join in. They were 12 hours late in doing so, and it was a very bad 12 hours for Ben Gurion and many other Israelis. But eventually the British and the French did attack their objectives in Egypt. President Eisenhower hit the roof, presumably of the White House. He communicated with Ben Gurion.
I propose that Israel immediately returns to its border.
And then, softening the tone, since it has completed its task of eliminating the Egyptian bases. But Moshe Dayan and his Israeli soldiers kept going. They swept all before them. By November the 5th, the Sinai Peninsula was in Israeli hands. To give some idea of the total victory, the Israelis had taken 6,000 Egyptian prisoners for the loss of 4 Israelis. The dead and wounded were also in an astonishing ratio. On the other hand, the British and French had fumbled their way into Egypt most ineffectively, but now the last battle must be fought to combat the political storm that was looming even around the world. The powerful nations of Britain and France ignominiously capitulated before they had even captured the Suez Canal zone. It wasn't Egyptian soldiers that stopped them, but the dark strictures of President Eisenhower and the threats from Russia. Ben Gurion wrote in his diary, "It has been a nightmarish day. A continuous stream of reports that Soviet planes and volunteers are entering Syria preparing to attack Israel. But it was President Eisenhower of the United States of America, with the threat of withdrawing all material support from Israel, that forced Ben Gurion to pull his young, victorious army out of Sinai." President Eisenhower then wrote to Ben Gurion, "I believe that Israel will have no cause to regret." Well, strangely, that proved to be possibly true. Ben Gurion broadcast to the Israeli people, "There is no power in the world that can take away from us our great victory. Israel after this Sinai campaign can never again be the Israel that was thought to exist before this tremendous victory. Ben Gurion now poured his energy into making friends for Israel and to doing all he could to make Israel secure from Arab attacks. Strangely, Ben Gurion met the German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, in America. On German soil would have been too traumatic. In the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, the German and the Jew took each other's hand. Ben Gurion asked Adenauer, "Will Germany lend Israel $1.5 billion to develop the Negev Desert?" Germany will help. Will Germany supply Israel with the military equipment that we have already requested of your defense minister? Germany will supply Israel with this equipment free of charge. As Ben Gurion left his meeting with Chancellor Adenauer, he said, "Last summer I told the Israeli parliament that Germany today is not the Germany of yesterday. After my encounter now with Dr. Adenauer, I am certain that my judgment was correct." Ben Gurion admired Charles de Gaulle very much. They met in the Élysée Palace. President de Gaulle said, "Under no circumstances will France sanction Israel's destruction. I will speak with Prime Minister Macmillan of Britain. You will receive their Centurion tanks and the best military aircraft in France." President de Gaulle said of Ben Gurion, "His character is noble. He is one of the greatest statesmen of our time." John Kennedy was elected President of the United States of America, and the old man went to America to meet him. The president looked to me like a 25-year-old boy. I said to myself, how can they elect such a young man to be president? And when Ben Gurion was making his leave, Kennedy asked him, "I was elected by the votes of the American Jews. What should I do to retain their support?" "Whatever is good for the free world." The old man instinctively fought to hand over his power to the youthful leaders of Israel. His favorite was Moshe Dayan. But his efforts led to bitter trouble with the older guard of Israeli politics, and aging fast, on June the 16th, 1963, he quietly said to his close friend, Yitzhak Nabon, "I am going to submit my resignation." During May 1967, President Nasser of Egypt once again closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping and sent massive military forces across the Suez Canal and up to the Israeli border. The Arab states, Jordan and Iraq, signed an anti-Israeli pact with Egypt, and Syria was rearing to go. In Egypt, Radio Cairo was beating the war drum. Brothers and soldiers of Egypt and heroic brothers in Jordan and Syria, forward to Tel Aviv. Every Arab must take revenge by destroying the nest of Zionist gangsters. But, on the other hand, Israel kept a near radio silence and struck the various Arab armies and their massive Russian armaments with a series of devastating blows. At the end of these 6 days, the three Arab armies, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Syrians, had been crushed and swept out of every space from which they could reasonably threaten Israel. The Arabs had lost unbelievable quantities of Russian military equipment and, far more tragically, thousands and thousands of their soldiers. The Russians and their subject states immediately broke off diplomatic contacts with Israel, and the Israelis had reached the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the foundations of their ancient temple. And Ben Gurion knew that the incredible victory had been gained without his active participation. Ben Gurion very gently turned to study philosophy and to writing his memoirs. During 1968, his wife, Paula, died. I always counted on my dying before Paula. Now suddenly, she is gone. Came Ben Gurion's 85th birthday, and Israel celebrated. The Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed a special law so that they could invite the old man to address them. His speech related the saga of the Jewish people. He began, "The state of Israel came into being by virtue of three things: the vision of redemption bequeathed to us by the ancient prophets of Israel, the creative enterprise of our pioneers over the last century,
and the heroism of our present-day warriors. Our future depends on two things: an increased immigration and on our remaining an elite people.
On the day of the Jewish religious festival, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Arabs attacked Israel once again and found the nation, as it were, on its religious knees. It was 1973, and it was a hard war. Ben Gurion became desperately ill. Nothing but gentleness remained, and he held out his being to all who wanted him, even to his old and formidable political rival, Menachem Begin, to whom he observed, "My Paula was always an admirer of yours." Ben Gurion died on the 1st of December, 1973. His instructions for the event were simple and clear: to be buried at Sde-Boker, by the side of Paula, and with as much silence as nature will allow. All around was the wilderness of Zin, where Moses had traveled with the children of Israel 4,000 years earlier.